it's really dark. Okay, so welcome. On behalf of the Political Science Department, I would like to welcome you to the Village Square, where woke ghosts die. Wait, what? And so I would first like to thank our administrators, Dr. Jones, the president of the college, Dr. Dempsey, the vice president of instruction, and Dr. Faye Lee, who is our division dean, for supporting this event. Our division staff in Division 3, Nadia, Sierra, Christina, Josh, and Jumana, for assisting us with putting this event together, as well as the departments from speech and history for supporting our events. And I would like to acknowledge my colleagues in the political science department, Professor Ashworth, who's in the back, who is the lead on this event. And then we have Professor Shulga and Kucharski, who are right back there. Professor Abraham, who's on the panel, and then myself. I would also like to thank the campus lead and Captain Tigniak for being a part of this event. And a special thanks to Josh Estrada for assisting with the setup and virtual components and the League of Women Voters site fair for providing their support and resources at all of our events. For those of you who don't know, Josh is the one right off to the side who is doing all of our technical stuff, but he has been with us since we first started our events the summer of 2022, and he often goes unrecognized, and so we thank him for everything that he does for our department. For those of you who are not aware, please be advised that this event is being recorded. As far as I know, your images are not captured on the recording, but the event is being recorded. And lastly, I would like to point your attention to the table as you entered and exited. There are several political science events that are upcoming. And so there's a promotion of many of those flyers for the Intro to Political Science class, the Political Science Club, which we have a panelist, Reese Matthews on the club, on the panel. He is the club president in the upcoming political science events. The next one is the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination in November. So I would like to introduce our speakers of the day. First, we have Professor Patrick Barton. Community Studies, who received 2 bachelor's degrees in film studies and communication studies from George Mason University, and a master's degree in communication studies from Kansas State University. He came to Lone Star College Cy-Fair in 2010, and since then has previously served as the Languages Department Chair, Faculty Senate President, and is currently the Faculty Fellow for the Teaching and Learning Center. He has a passion for attending and performing in live theater, discussing the latest movies, and dissecting the political rhetoric of the day. Dr. Angela Bell is a professor of history and dual credit department chair at Lone Star College Cy-Fair. Dr. Bell received a Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education with a special emphasis in social studies and English, and a master's degree in history, and a PhD in history from the University of Missouri. She is a religious historian with primary research interests in gender, race, genocide, and the antebellum apocalyptic religion. Since 2014, she has participated in the Max A. Kaplan Institute for Educators at the Holocaust Museum in Houston, and was the 2019 Kenya Lively Fellow for the 2019 International Seminar in English at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, Israel. Next, we have the Political Science Club President, Reese Matthew. He is a Lone Star College honors student. He is also a president of the club. He has brought his passion for civil discourse to the Political Science Club by establishing a monthly pizza and politics meeting where students gather to discuss controversial current events. He recently completed an internship with the Lone Star College System Office of General Counsel, and he is headed to law school. Finally, we have Dr. Janu Abraham, who is a professor of political science. A native to New York, Dr. Abraham joined us at Lone Star College Cy-Fair in 2018. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Binghamton University, and his Master's and PhD in Political Science from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Dr. Abraham specializes in comparative politics and international relations. Prior to turning it over to the panelists, our department would like to give the context on this event. Even in relationships with the best of intentions, breakdowns in communication can often be a significant source of conflict. In these highly polarized times, it is important that we are able to communicate effectively, especially with our political counterparts. All too often, inflammatory terms are tossed around in the political arena with the intention to incite negative emotion from the average citizen, rather than to generate contemplation or understanding. The situation is further intensified when terms such as woke become highly politicized, divisive, and yet remain so ambiguous in terms of a commonly accepted definition. Brené Brown has identified the significance of having access to the right words and describes language as the portal to meaning-making connection, healing, learning, and self-awareness. When we do not have the language to talk about what we are experiencing, our ability to make sense of the world and to discuss it with others is severely limited. Today, we will explore the term woke, the origins of the term, and the connotations associated with it. We will discuss contemporary controversies that have developed as a result of something or someone being labeled as woke. And we will reflect on how the ambiguity of terms and the use of identity politics can be weaponized by political elites. We are going to start with a short video for context, and then I will turn it over to our speakers.
We're living in a time where we're more divided than ever, and we need a common vocabulary to talk about these differences.
One question I do have is, what is woke?
The truth is, the word woke has lived many lives and iterations.
Right around 1967 is when you had a lot of like power movements and kind of civil rights issues going on at that time. It was called consciousness. It means basically having consciousness about some of the systemic issues that are taking place that have unintended consequences that kind of seem as though but again, there's things that we're not necessarily thinking about.
The word woke, though, became more mainstream in 2015, with more and more people using it that didn't know the word's origins.
It was woke too. I was woke.
Perversion.
Woke. It's discrimination. It's reverse discrimination.
I honestly don't understand it, so it's a hard question to answer. I don't understand the woke.
By whom?
Barlow. Woke to me is extremes. I think it's taking a lot of things out of context. I think it's just attacking people for their simple views that they have.
What means can't say it on air.
Say it, you can say it.
It's BS. Wokeness is about us more dangerous than any pandemic hands down.
The woke mind virus, the woke in education, woke in the corporation, the woke in the halls of Congress, the woke mob, woke ideology.
Woke military, woke financial scams, woke fascism, woke left, woke politicians, woke gender ideology, woke generals, woke tyranny, woke multinational corporations, woke at the top levels. They woke takeover of the entire federal government.
Is a term created by Black Americans, and it basically means being aware of what's going on around you, especially when it comes to issues of race and social justice.
Topics like woke is just a complete distraction from actual issues.
So far, the only person to define what woke actually is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Late last year, his staffers were asked to define woke in court. His communications director defined woke as a slang term for activism, progressive activism. His general counsel added that woke is the belief that there are systemic injustices in American society and the need to address them.
Let's start with this whole thing about woke. We don't know what woke means. Being woke means never having to say you're sorry. Woke means never letting anyone say they're sorry. Woke is racist. Big woke means equity, diversification, gender, and racial disparities. This wokeness that's happening at Madison's house and Jefferson's house, where all they do is talk about slavery. Wokeism is about pink fun.
You know what woke means? Feature a listener.
Now it's drag queens and children and church. The woke is the new religion of the left.
I don't know what the definition of woke so much is.
It takes, it's taken 6 weeks to get a sample. It's terrible. We used to get it in 2 weeks. A lot of this too. Woke.
Well, I think it shows how wokeism destroys everything fun in our society.
Statement of wokeism, Marxism, is to destroy the nuclear family.
That's wokeism sort of in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, it's accepting everything that's evil as good.
To me, woke is going out of your way to please everybody around you, and to accept any ideology that you feel is comfortable for them.
In Chick-fil-A, you are no longer the Lord's chicken, you're actually the woke chicken.
And I don't like the term woke because I hear woke, you know, it's like just a term that just half the people can't even define what they don't know what it is.
You know, you stop now, let it be covered. Great, hi everybody. For those who came in just now, my name is Patrick Cardinal, President of Speech Communication. I'm gonna wander a little bit, before I get started, I'm going to do a little housekeeping because I'm also the sign-in sheet guy. I collect all the sign-ins, so if you are coming in now, or if you came earlier, you didn't scan a QR code, there's a QR code in the back by the refreshments on that table. If you're a student, put all your professor names in there, we're gonna tell them that you came to the session today and brag on you. If you're an employee, go ahead and sign in with patient professional development credit. And if you're a community member, we're just gonna say hi. So let me just ask really quickly, we heard a lot of different definitions of woke right there. Who here just wants to say, what do you think woke means? What does it mean to you? Because language is individual for a lot of us. Who wants to throw it out, raise your hand or shout it out? What's woke mean to you?
I think we'll, like, yeah, aware of concepts of like what's going on around you.
Be aware of any possible what's going on. And what else?
For a long time, I thought woke means okay.
Yeah?
Yeah,
All right.
because,
Sure. Well. Anybody else? No. What? No. To do stuff. Yeah. Yeah, to know stuff. You're just gonna say chicken? Anybody else? What does woke mean to you? Yeah. Okay. And agendas, government,
I think politically it means progressive.
progressive. How about this? When do you think this term, you heard a little bit about the video, but when do you think this term really came about? Like, can anybody pinpoint, like, when you started hearing the word woke, and a lot of you are younger, so, you know, may not go that far back, but those of you who are not as younger. When do you remember hearing the word woke? Like last 2 or 3, 5 years, like you say. What else? What do you think? Right. The right time. 50. Sure.
First time you do street lighting, I know.
It's an older term, yeah. I heard this for the first time this year, yeah.
I think that, the right has defined woke more than the original started. I mean, I've heard more against it that I couldn't raise my hand and tell you what it was.
Right.
Because all I've got is.
All the talking heads we just heard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's just say George Floyd, that's when I heard it a lot. And that's when I remember
It's a big one.
George Floyd.
That's like, yeah, it's funny, right? So, it does go a little further back than that, and actually, the first term, and so, woke is actually part of what is known as African American vernacular language. These are words, language that are typically used in the African American Black community in America, and, it started back. There's actually a really early, like the 1860s, 1870s usage, but that's not typically cited. So the earliest that most people recognize is Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican philosopher, social activist, in 1923. Wow. Had a collection of aphorisms that he wrote, and one of the aphorisms was "Wake up, Ethiopia, wake up, Africa." Ethiopia, wake up, Africa. And then use the word woke, we use the word wake in the sense of trying to wake people up to injustices that are happening, particularly in Ethiopia. There was this blues musician named Leadbelly. Anybody heard Leadbelly? Yeah, Leadbelly was a blues musician from the early part of the 20th century. In 1938, he wrote a song called Scottsboro Blues. It was about a group of black men who were accused of assaulting white women and falsely accused. And so he wrote this song called Scottsboro Blues. And there's a recording of that song afterwards where he's been talking. And he said, really hard to hear, but I will get the finance with, he's like, you gotta stay woke. So what's happening for black, the black community attacked by white, which is really prevalent, obviously, back then. In 1962, this is another big milestone. There's a black novelist named William Melvin Kelly. He actually wrote a New York Times article called "If You're Woke, Dig It." He wrote this article, "If You're Woke, You Dig It." That was the first kind of usage of woke in the sense that we're thinking of it in a socially conscious way. And the whole article is actually about how white culture often appropriates black culture. And we've seen this over and over again in music, but he specifically talked about the beatnik culture. Those know what the beatniks are. It's kind of like this movement of folks, younger folks back in the 50s and 60s who were very anti-materialistic, kind of like what were they called? The hippies, like, or the hippies that were beatniks. Okay. And the beatniks used language like cool, dig it, man. And the beatniks were usually white people. And dig it and cool were black men. And so Marcus, I'm sorry, I think William Kelly wrote, you know, often this happens. White people steal what black people say and appropriate it. And that's known as, by the way, linguistic appropriation. And so when one culture makes it worse, but it's not white people taking it for black people. I mean, it happens all over, but it is something that's really prevalent. Now we're going to flip over another 40 plus years to Erykah Badu, who did a song that was actually a song that I think called Master Teacher. And she redid it, she updated it, and added this refrain, I stay woke, I stay woke, I stay woke. Now at the time, she was writing about a partner cheating on another partner. You gotta stay woke to let the partner do it, so not cheating on it. But then that turned into something in 2014. Anybody remember in 2014 that was kind of a big deal? Where all of a sudden the hashtag stay woke was really big. 2014. So I love playing the game. Let's get what the teachers have. So something happened in Ferguson, Missouri.
Oh,
Yeah. So what happened is a young man named Michael Brown was killed by police officers. And this was a year after a man named George Zimmerman was acquitted of killing right. And George Zimmerman was just a citizen out, you know, and hustled with this kid named Trayvon Martin. He was unarmed. So in 2013, he was acquitted, and this thing called the Black Lives Matter movement sprung up, BLM. And then a year after that, Michael Brown, Ferguson happened. And all of a sudden, in addition to BLM, we had Stay Woke. That was the first time the hashtag Stay Woke really came about, along with the hashtag BLM. So that became almost synonymous. Stay Woke and BLM were really intertwined. And then in the late 2010s, woke became a paradigm. Saturday Night did a skit about it, right? When Saturday Night does a skit of it, it's very, very popular. So I know something that I haven't heard about it this year, the last few years, or one of the things or whatever. And that's because, much like a lot of other words, like social justice. Social justice, by the way, social justice is not like a thing. To have justice within a social realm, sounds like a good thing. But I'm sure some of you remember the weaponization of social justice when they started calling people social justice warriors, SJWs. And it was this way for those who were on the far right to mock people on the left. This has been done over and over again. Political correctness, being like mocking people who are triggered by certain things. They mock people who talk about intersectionalism. Intersectionalism is the idea that, you know, gender and race and sexual orientation, all these things intersect and create all these layers of interaction with the world, including with discrimination. Now, lately, it's really become almost a performative thing, and just like William kind of wrote, and too, woke has now been pretty much appropriated by white people, in that it now means almost anything. Just like, oh, it means stay woke, about Elon Musk, or stay woke about this, or stay woke about that, which are all really important issues. But it was originally intended to be something for the Black community in America to be aware of what's happening. And even in this crowd right now, we didn't get a lot of answers that are similar to that. It's a more broad term, which isn't a bad thing, by the way. Language changes, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's important to remember the history of where we're coming from. Because we do have a bad habit, especially with people who like white folks, of kind of like saying, oh, you know, this is how the world is, what we do, and not listening enough to the folks who don't look like us. We've been adopting culture for a long time, and in the United States at least. So I think it's important to have this conversation and figure out why is this such a big deal, and why do certain people villainize like this idea of being socially conscious about the problems of our world. And we're gonna talk about that last one. I'll pass it over to Nick.
All right. So as Katie, Dr. Green, sorry, well, my name is Angela Bell, I'm a history professor here at Western College. And I have a poll for you. This is a simple raise your hand if you have heard of this thing. Yeah, I'm gonna read off a list of words or phrases. It's very easy, you cannot be wrong. Okay, all right. How many have heard of the word bias? What about objectivity? History repeats itself. Indoctrination. Anti-intellectualism. Political correctness. Social justice. Identity politics. Dogmas. Okay, so you've heard all these terms over and over and over, probably. As a historian, I think there is something that we need to be aware kind of what's going on with regard to what is going on in our schools, and also with regard to how it is that we look at the things that are happening in the world around us and how that will be remembered later. So I'll tell you that I have a random story that if you're in my classes ever, you know that I have lots of random stories. But the first time that I kind of was confronted with someone else asking me what wokeness was, it was a few years ago. I've heard it for a long time, but I had a friend who is older than me. She's kind of a mentor type of person. She used to teach in public school, and she and I usually will have dinners. And we have a mutual friend. My friend Carolyn is about 77 or so, which is significantly older than me, just so you know. And then we have a mutual friend by the name of Cheris, who is in her 80s, in her late 80s. And Cheris, God bless her, decided that she had found out that Carolyn and I were having dinner, and she decided that she wanted to join us. She had told Carolyn that she wanted to have me over for dinner sometime because she wanted to ask me, this 86-year-old woman, what is the definition of woke? And so she decided, instead of having me over to dinner, she was going to have me pick her up, and she was going to join us for dinner, so that I could explain to her on the ride to where we were going to dinner what it meant to be woke. This was about 3 years ago. And I was like, how do I explain this to an 86-year-old woman? How do I tell her what this means? Because at the time, this was just when that kind of flip was happening, where it had been that being woke meant that you were kind of aware of things that were going on around you, and aware of various different viewpoints and various different racial and gender and so on and so forth kind of ideas. And then there was the kind of taking over of it and turning it into something that was right. So I was trying to explain it to her, and I was driving in rush hour talking to people, and you can imagine that was super fun. So I finally got to the point where I was like, well, really, Paris, I think what you're asking me is if you are woke or not. And she said, yes, that's exactly what I'm asking you. And I was like, yes, you are. We were able to ask you this, right? So one of the things that I tried to explain to her is how it is that as a historian, I get asked these questions a lot. And there's something that I think is a fundamental misunderstanding of what history is. And I talk about this with my students a lot, where how many of you, just out of curiosity, again, there is no wrong answer. I'm not going to give you a grade. And I'm not going to judge you. But how many of you, when you think about history, it is a list of things and dates and places? Kind of. Okay, so, in the grand scheme of things, that's part of what history is. But what history really is looking at how something, looks at point A, and then something looks at point B, and how do we get from point A to point B? In other words, what changed, what events happened that got us from here to here? And so it's very often not a list of things or a list of dates or a list of people. It is the events that happen that take us from point A to point B. In other words, it's a story. So when you're looking at history and you have this kind of story about what America is, what American history is, or what is the history of certain groups of people in the United States, it's really hard for us to not have all those parts of the story. Because if you only have one part of the story, and you've ever read one, then you went to see the movie and they cut everything out, right? That's kind of what it is if we don't talk about different groups of people. And so there is this kind of intentional frustration, I think, intentional frustration that is being kind of pushed upon teachers, in particular historians, who are trying to say, this is what happened. And then people saying, you're trying to tell us something different. You're rewriting history to tell us something that's not true. I've heard this all my life. I've heard it a lot from people who think they know what history is and don't. But there is this kind of, right now, there is this kind of like emphasis on what is rewriting history. You've all heard of rewriting history. Yeah, we're going to rewrite history and we're going to make people feel guilty about it, right? So, I will give you an example of when history was actually written. Just checking time here. It is complicated, and also I will try to get it to you in a very short kind of context. So you all heard of the American Civil War, yes? It happened. There was an event of the American Civil War. Who won? You all don't sound convinced, so you know for sure. So yeah. You know. So, what is the saying about who writes history? The winners write history. This is an example where that did not happen. So, what happens is the United States engages in the Civil War, the North wins, the Union wins. And there are certain lessons that we kind of learned from that. One, we get rid of slavery, supposedly. Two, we are going to accept that the federal government is stronger than the state governments. And so there are all sorts of lessons that we learned. That industry probably is needed, and also agriculture, but industry definitely as well. About 30 years after the war is over, there's a group of people called the United Daughters of the Confederacy who are very upset that their children are growing up without knowing what the Confederacy is about. And so they start an organization in which they start educating people, Southern children, for the most part, with readers and essay contests and scholarships and boarding schools that are going to teach a version of history that is the Southern version. So for instance, they're teaching children how to read out of a book called The KKK or The Invisible Empire. They're learning to read by reading about it. So this is a rewriting of history. The UDC convinces people that the South is an idyllic place, it's like for happiness. And then professional historians start writing reconstructive history as well. And they've been writing it all along, but you know, it takes a while for something to happen before you can actually write history about it. And so there's this school called the William Dunning School. And the William Dunning School writes reconstructive history by saying that white Southerners had slaves because they were unable to take care of themselves. And so this is accepted as historical record. Okay, so we don't have, that has largely been done away with at this point. So what happens is during the 60s and 70s with the civil rights movement, you have this kind of attempt to look at other groups that have not been talked about in American history. And so you start opening up archives and that kind of thing, and you start opening the sources. And one of the things that I want to make sure you understand with historians, people always say, you can't change history, you can't rewrite history. And what I will say is that's what historians do all the time. Historians look at the sources that are available to them and then they write things. So if historians have a new source, then what are they gonna do? They're gonna look at it and they're going to incorporate it into the sources they already have. And it may or may not change the way that you looked at things. And so, following the Dunning School in the 30s saying this is the way it was, then you have you have a way of looking at history that gives us different sources. It takes African Americans seriously. It looks at records that have been closed before, and so then you have this new record. Also, one of the things to remember, and I will close, is that historians are always biased, right? I asked you how many of you were biased or objectively. All of you have heard this, right? I cannot tell you the number of times I have had someone read something and say, oh, this is so biased. And I'm like, of course it's biased, because everybody is biased, because we all have biases, right? And so what I'm always trying to kind of say is, if you think this is biased, it's likely because it is against your own bias. It is not that you are unbiased, it is that you have a bias that is different than that bias. And so what we do as historians is we look at this work and we say, okay, who wrote this? When was it written? Where was it written? What was the agenda behind it? What type of source is it? If it's a diary, that's going to be very different than if someone's giving a speech. If it's a letter to your husband, it's very different than a letter to, say, a representative of Congress. If it's written right after something happens, it's going to be different than if you write about it 30 years later. And so it's our responsibility as historians to look at the evidence that we have and then create a story that goes along with it, supported by our evidence. So when you hear something like history is being rewritten, that's because that's what our job is. That's what we do. And it's not because we're trying to rewrite it to say it, to give you a false history. It's an attempt to maybe a more complete history. So there you go. That's my spiel for the day.
So I'm gonna take a little bit of a different tack. So what I'm gonna be doing here is I'm gonna be focusing on how, kind of building on what we talked about already, how the word woke is just filled through with ambiguity. It's just very difficult to pin down what this word exactly means, and it's been weaponized in so many ways. What I'm going to be showing you here to look for, what I'm going to be talking from, are these slides about one of the primary ways that people currently engage with this term, and it's through consumers. It's through boycotts of companies they feel are standing up against their values. In this case, in this era, conservative. So the next slide here. You all remember where you were when you saw this abomination? The very famous Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad, right there, right after the George Floyd protests. So it was a 3-minute ad. I don't mean to show you the whole ad, I think it's a waste of everyone's time, but the setup for the ad was, tensions are heightened between protesters on one side, and remember this, right after the George Floyd protests. Protesters on one side, the police on the other, tensions are ramping up, and Kendall Jenner solved everything by giving everyone vests, right? And then the end, right? So this was a widely mocked, understandable ad. And what we see here, and what I think this is indicative of, is that a lot of companies, and this has been ramping up, I'm not saying this is entirely new, but a lot of companies have been trying to tie themselves to social justice causes in their advertisements. And then this has prompted, along with this discussion of wokeness, this backlash of, well, okay, these companies are spouting values that are not in line with my own, so I have to strike them. I have to boycott, I have to send angry letters, send angry emails, I have to oppose this in some way. So the next slide here, it's just like a kind of smattering of all these different ad campaigns or even media properties. I think most of you might remember a few of these. Dylan Mulvaney, trans influencer, who's pretty big on TikTok, Bud Light campaign, Colin Kaepernick's Nike ad. This is a movie poster for the new Little Mermaid movie. Halle Bailey, African American actress. This was a very famous Gillette ad, and still from there, talking about toxic masculinity, also got a lot of backlash. This is the still from a Pixar movie called Lightyear, where this, it was kind of like a blanket and innocent sort of thing, but, there were, showing a lesbian couple who were raising a dog. All of these, if you notice, intellectual properties, or just big brands, or big apparel brands, all embracing diversity and social justice causes. All of these led to intense scrutiny and backlash from conservative media. One thing I wanted to mention here, and this is actually something basically building off of what Patrick said, talking about how wokeness, the whole term is kind of suffused with ambiguity. The only thing people saw of the Little Mermaid, the remake or the remake starring Halle Bailey, the only thing people saw of it was the poster, and they declared the movie was woke. People saw, people would see stills of, let's say, the lesbian couple in Lightyear, and they would declare the movie or Pixar or Disney had gone woke. So when we talk about ambiguity in this kind of sense, when we talk about how wokeness is kind of suffused with that, it seems to be, I don't want to see certain people on my television, or I don't want to see certain people in the movie theater, I don't want to see this or that group being represented. And so that's what we tend to see when it comes to this sort of thing as well. And when we talk about how all of these, advertising campaigns or media properties prompt some backlash. What is particularly interesting here is that in the past, it tended to be these boycotts or consumer activism tended to be much more originating in the left or left-leaning boycotts. I don't like what this company said about China's dealing with Tibet, or I don't like how this company is putting tobacco ads in magazines. And so we're going to boycott. But now it seems that consumer boycotts and consumer activism are coming from others of the politics. Now, another kind of an aspect of this that's important too. Actually, you can move on to the next slide. Right, it's what I call the new age of consumer activism. Calls for boycotts and pressure campaigns. Companies that seem to engage in activism or have beliefs that are contrary to those of the consumer, those are the ones that get targeted. That, oh, this company is trying to push an agenda, or this company is trying to indoctrinate our children or our youth. And this last part that I'm coming back to wrap all this up, there's an underlying assumption that corporations that engage in activism or that engage in this sort of thing, that they're deeply committed to these particular causes. And that's something that we're going to interrogate later. There's another aspect of this here. So it's not just on the consumer end, but what we're seeing is on the end of people making these investments. So on the next slide here, this is what's called ESG investing. And you got a little bit into that in the video. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. One of the Republican primary challengers, Vivek Ramaswamy, talks about this all the time. We kind of put this on the map. These are three benchmarks for how investment firms should direct their funds. You have some of the big players that I'm sure you've heard of, BlackRock and Vanguard. They are the ones that say, you know what, we should let the companies that we should give consumers the option to invest in companies that have high environmental standards, have open accountability when it comes to their corporate or socially responsible. And in general, the investors have actually really benefited, or the investors have rewarded these companies for allowing them to invest in such a what we see here, just like with the media boycotts or consumer backlash against different apparel companies, you are seeing a backlash against ESG benchmarks throughout the country. Now the next slide here, and kind of wrapping this all up, what we talk about when we talk about apparel companies, media companies, despite all of the talk of boycotts, despite all of the consumer pressure, if you actually take a look at how effective any of this is, very little noticeable movement in stock prices for companies subject to these boycotts, so-called boycotts. Difficult to link boycotts to lost profitability of media properties. So
And the last part, asset management firms guided by ESG principles have consistently outperformed those that proposed guidelines. So even for kind of a second bullet point here, saying that I'm gonna boycott Bud Light, that didn't really work. I'm gonna boycott Bud Light because, you know, they use the trans influence in their marketing. What ended up happening, which I also find funny, is that a lot of people went to Modelo, which is also owned by Anheuser-Busch, right? Which is owned by the same parent. So if you actually take a look at the stock price, a little bit of all the pressure caused the stock price to drop a bit, but it's well within the 10-year performance. So asset management firms guided by these principles, your Vanguard or BlackRock, they're not going anywhere. Vanguard and BlackRock, they each have something like $7 trillion worth of assets that they manage, trillion with the T. And so even, you know, these companies, they're really not going anywhere when it comes to their investment decisions. The very last thing that I wanted to, the last slide too, kind of bringing this all together. The citizens versus consumers that I call it. Now, the most important thing here that I want to really emphasize is kind of the why. So when we talk about, you know, wokeness, and okay, well, I don't like what this company is doing, so I'm going to boycott, or I'm going to start pressuring. The real key here is to keep in mind, companies do not engage in activism. They legally cannot engage in activism. They engage in profits, returns to shareholders. So when it comes to this idea of how this company is engaging in this type of social justice campaign, they're not engaging in it because they care about the issue. They're engaging in it because they see potential avenues for profit. And so when it comes to the citizens versus consumers idea, we are all taught, you know, if you grew up in the United States, you were educated here, you were taught one man, one vote, or one man and woman, one vote. But now it's become $1, one, or I vote with my dollars. And so the way we express our displeasure with some of these companies is that we move our dollars, we move our investments. And so I think this speaks to something bigger, and this is not something I can address in like a couple of minute presentation. But generally, people in the US feel sort of powerless and disconnected from their institutions. You know, I vote, but it doesn't seem like anything changes, right? Or I'm informed, and the only thing that being informed gets me is this kind of sense of like depression. I mean, there's just a sense of powerlessness. And so how can I engage? Well, I can just move my dollars here. And that's the general sense that we see here. The idea that, well, I don't really know how to engage as a citizen. I don't really know what I can do to make my community better or to affect positive change in the area that I live. But I do know, you know, well, moving my dollars here to there, that's something I can do. And so that is something, you know, once again, I don't really have a solution for that, but that seems to be a lot of what a lot of the modern day presentation or modern day stuff in the world seems to be. This company is doing this, I don't like it, I'm going to use my voice. So that's all I have for you. So I think we're gonna take questions. Okay, good. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start my introduction. Hello, Bruce Matthew, I'm the president of the Political Science Club. My administration is focusing on facilitating dialogue with students regarding political and controversial topics because, as other speakers have gone over and as we saw in the introductory video, we live in a very sort of divisive, sort of ideologically divided sort of, when I say time of when it comes to discussing politics, and the sort of extreme use of, say, the term woke has been sort of a worrying thing for me since I'm trying to facilitate dialogue with students. When people are using the term, obviously everyone seems to be having a difficult time actually defining or examples of what it may mean. That's difficult for conversations, especially with students who are either apolitical or independent or not entirely sort of, they're just dipping their toes in their political things. We're going to go over that with some amateur, polling we did for our club, with over 100 students. I go ahead slightly. So what did we ask? We asked, who did we ask? We asked, around 100 students, and the vast majority of which are for, so young adults just out of high school or on their way to, their careers and their stuff, and their sort of, experience and fun stuff. Well, something worth noting is that not only do students on campus, the vast majority of those over young adults, actually, the vast majority consider it a problem. But it's also worth noting, once we go to the next slide as well, that most students are, as I mentioned earlier, apolitical, non-political. They're not so much aware of some of the usage of the term woke by, say, Ron DeSantis or other political ideologues. So the next slide, it's a little telling. When we did a sort of, we asked students, hey, can you define the term woke in one word? And the vast majority of these independent, non-political students were very straightforward and set there. But as we saw earlier, it's all over the place. You have people saying words like stupidity or alert or ignorant or like agenda, annoy, bad, Democrat, autopilot, leftist, all kinds of words. It's all over the place. But the vast majority of students who are, of course, apolitical, come straightforward and said, woke is aware. Not so much as politically charged as many of the other speakers were coming to, especially with how political ideologues have been using the term sort of label, and how I see it as sort of using the word conservative or progressive or some activist ideals. And as the purpose of my club is to facilitate dialogue among students. That's very worrying to me because I don't want students to be having conversations and using words that are, and sort of just be pejorative or the other side of the spirit. That's not helpful for a political discussion, especially when people struggle to define the word itself. I found that very sort of interesting in a sense that my worries about that word sort of become a problem during our politics and pizza events, which is where we have event monthly, where we have students come into a room and sit down and discuss politics in a casual, moderated format. Because this year, in a sense, to sort of hone down the heat that comes with having political conversations, sit down, have a casual discussion over something really great. So having this word sort of being used in political, in a political context is definitely sort of a worrying thing when I'm trying to have these discussions with students and how these discussions sort of be effective and be able to empathize with the other side, understand what they're thinking. If we're using a word that no one can really define, and simply serves as sort of a negative pejorative or something we disagree with, that's not helpful in the slightest. That's the political science club president. I sort of see like I'm kind of sort of in a way happy that students sort of are not being roped into perhaps a more the usage seems to be primarily older, more generations sort of outside the young adult range that we primarily surveyed in our poll. So I'm kind of in a sense relieved that students aren't going to be using a sort of entity term. But to wrap it all up, students on campus are not, in a sense, being roped into this ideological sort of wording, and for my role as president to facilitate dialogue among students, that's sort of a really good thing, and I also want to sort of preface this by saying that, so, by prefacing that, God, everything. But yeah, it was interesting to conduct that poll on students and to see if they're actually using this term that no one seems to be able to. Anyway, I did that right so.
Open it up for questions, discussion. So does anybody have any questions about the term or the term being used around you that you're like not really sure what it means or what's intended when they're using it?
Yeah, so I just want to know, like, personally, what would each of these say woke is?
What would each of us say?
Yeah.
Woke is?
Yeah, say being socially conscious, socially aware, aware of the problems that are in our society, that are systemic, that are all.
Yeah, very similar to that.
Okay.
It is looking at systemic issues and the historical context of these groups of people or people who have been marginalized throughout history and being aware of that story within the context of American history or local history.
I mostly just see it as a pejorative and sort of like the other, and it's usually used by sort of more right-leaning conservative ideologues such as Ron DeSantis and other people in the field. So I sort of see it as simply a pejorative, sort of a negative term, and also sort of vacuous in the sense that it doesn't seem to have a solid definition that's
I'm not personally crazy about the term, but just that because of the ambiguity, like I said. But I think the definition that I would kind of stick to is that you look at systems, you don't look at individuals. You don't see things as a result of this particular individual action. You see it as, well, this is the result of the interaction of systems. Race, economics, particular, let's say, expressions of masculinity, whatever it may be. And so it's moving away from explaining everything via individual actions and motivations to see.
Okay.
Yeah. If the word work is defined, will be defined, and you can see that from the positive trend. So when someone uses like the word will multiple times, like say you broadcasting, right? And same thing, our really bias, in fact, we keep questioning around the meetings for you know what I mean? There, look at, make that question, you know, someone can say, well, the name on, you know.
I'll start with this. Yes, I think it's a short answer to that. I tend to not like pushing very well. And partly that is because pushes are used because they simplify something in a way that usually takes all the meaning out of it. And so for someone like me, who's a historian, like what we do is we look at nuance, we look at all these different things that are happening. And so when you have somebody say, whoa, or you have somebody say history repeats itself, or you have somebody say any of those kind of cliches that you hear all the time, what that's doing is it's reducing something. So it's not looking at kind of the real information. And so personally, I don't use the term, but I understand the history of it. So I understand when people are using it as a positive thing, I understand what that means. And when people are using it as a pejorative thing, I understand what that means. And so for me, I just avoided the journal. And I would rather, what does that look like in context of history rather than what, like, am I going to use it? When I hear people using cliches all the time, what I usually think is they don't know. I saw this hand first. I don't buy it, I have been calling people, sorry.
So. But. It seems like, personally, and among my peers, it's more, we can see it very apparent, it's more of a negative term than the appropriation which, has been taking, how you go about. So that, what is it to do now? Because we're not gonna use this word anymore, people who originally did it and the original meaning sort of was, kind of like let these people keep using the dogs when there's nothing for us to do, or like what steps you can take, or what you just like now realize like what we know what they're saying, what their agenda is, just let it be, or whatever. Yeah, I think that words can be reclaimed. And I'm a big fan of like, if I were to come in, and if any of you are one of the folks in here, like, who do woke in the Georgia stuff, like Reed said, I would love to talk to you and just explain my perception, because I think words can be reclaimed, and we've seen this like the LGBTQ community, word queer, used to be a pejorative against gay people, and now, I mean, queer is almost this it's like an overarching term for people who are and I think actually I was gonna say that we can come up with a different word, but we come up with a different word, it's just gonna be co-opted by anti-progressives. Right, so and I identify as so we're transparent here. I'm a progressive person, and an anti-progressive person is going to whatever we come up with to say, you know, this is the agenda, right? So I'd like to have a conversation with somebody who is using it as a majority and go, can I explain what it means to me? And can you tell me why that's a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing to be aware that people are hurt in the world? And it's because of us. Why is that a bad thing? And I really feel like a lot of times liberal folks tend to try to be so it almost becomes too much. Like, people get hurt. And you gotta kind of like, you gotta say, oh no, you gotta hurt your feelings. You can have a conversation. So that's just my opinion. I think it's interesting because the words like snowflake, trigger, social justice warrior, those have had a strictly negative connotation, but with what seems to be there's still a split. There's a back. Some people take it as a compliment, some people take it as an insult. So it's interesting on that word, maybe because of how it can mean different things to different people. It's something that's still kind of up in the air, but with other terms.
I have two questions. I think there's two things that are really critical of this whole vote thing. That's the strength of our military. They're saying our military is too low, they can't find, so it's a problem. And then also the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in this state, they say that's worthless. We don't have to do anything with that. So those are the two real applications of what and where we're seeing it as far as military readiness, whether or not we need to have those departments in this state. But one of the things in terms of these sort of working powerful state, I go, wow, that really brought it back, because we used to be the ducks. And so we used to buy the ducks and now we're talking, so it's not low, we have to say, we have to say, oh, our ducks, we have to go to falcons, because that's a much more boat kind of get. So that really made me think about it. And over on Monday at North Harris campus, they showed the documentary Trustworthy. And the producer of the movie came out and answered questions for about a half hour. But in that movie and her discussion, you saw these buzzwords, and this goes to communication. The communication was fake news, the media, and now woke is one of them. So when I hear those words, I think, are you even thinking?
I mean, it's just like you're just buzzing, you know, it's just like a buzz, it's not really showing any thought at all. And it even got into a Christmas card, I got a Christmas card, last year, where in their letter, they put, they had no white, woke people. So it was just unbelievable, on the way the words infiltrated, and then as we just heard a minute ago, Trump said, if you're woke, you're losing. So there you go. There you go right there. You're a loser if you're woke. So military and DEI.
What was the question?
Sorry?
What was your specific, would you have a specific question or just on the?
The specific question on the military is, we say our military is too woke, therefore they cannot defend us properly. And the question is DEI, the state says we don't need it, let's get rid of it, it's too woke. So those are two applications of the word woke, military and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Who's saying that the military is too woke, like what's the difference?
Most of the Republican Party, they confronted Billy, the guy in charge, and they said, your military is not ready, you're too woke. You need to get unwoke so that you can fight. And so all you're thinking about is diversity, equity, inclusion, you need to think about, the enemy and getting defending America.
Also, they criticized Milley for being too woke because he spoke against Trump's response during January 6th. So he was that general was described as woke because of that.
I think I'm kind of familiar with this because, the kind of like with the corporations, right? If you know, if you're the head of a big corporation, you know that let's say 10% of the people that walk into your store identify as LGBT people, part of that community. Like, why wouldn't you market? Like, you're leaving dollars on the maybe you're so in the same sense, the military is at a real recruitment in right now for a lot of reasons. So why wouldn't you pass as broad as possible to get new recruits? Also, I think Senator, he's from Alabama. Yeah, he has a current hold on a lot of military promotions, and he uses this term a lot. Like, our military is too woke, they're worthless, they can't fight. He'll say these things, and he talked a lot about poem reading and stuff in on aircraft carriers and things like that. Yeah, it's very specific and very odd because I know that the military actually for soldiers that are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, they have a lot of programs aimed at people with PTSD in particular. And one thing that they do is that they actually will have things like poetry readings, people who read, let's say, like read tragedies. And then, somebody in the class would know this better than I do, but there's a Greek tragedy where Ajax comes back from war, Greek hero, and he sees all of these people. He sees the war is over. He sees what he thinks are people, and he mercilessly slaughters this whole bunch of people. But they're all animals. Right? They're all animals that he mercilessly rips apart. And he drags them back to put his house. And I was listening to this interview with this wife of someone who's suffering from PTSD. Husband had gone for multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And she said that reading group was so helpful because she understood why her husband was bringing these dead animals into her house. Right? So that was, so the wokeness, it's very silly to talk about. When you take something out of context, and you'll see the actual application. So.
It's interesting to me because Adam Driver, who Kyle Ren and various other people, is actually somebody who was in the Marine that started one of these organizations to help soldiers who come home from the war to express their emotions in a way that they cannot do. So you have somebody who is in entertainment, just considered by many people to be something that's very low, but he was also a Marine who fought. Well, he was not the point but that's not a story around it. You can go listen to it. But it's kind of fascinating that I had not heard that before. The phone doing that. I just
Sure. The
the term dog whistle has been used a couple of times. I was wondering if you guys could speak to like what exactly is a dog whistle? And then maybe what you guys think as far as the influence of political elites using terms that are inflammatory or dog whistles.
Well, to me, a dog whistle is similar to like an inside joke. It's sort of like an insider, like if you're not a part of the group, you wouldn't understand the terms. So for instance, if you're not politically active like most of the students on campus, you likely won't know how what was being weaponized by political ideologues. And like other sort of inflammatory language doesn't do much to help facilitate dialogue with students or even like their family, or even just the American public at large. In a sense that to me that's a very tragic thing, because you have people screaming, say woke at each other, but they don't know what it means. No one's having a conversation. Someone in the audience said it's kind of like just a bunch of buzzing, a bunch of noise. No one's actually communicating. And to me, that's very shocking because we live in a democracy. And the whole point of the democracy is that you're supposed to have liberty to communicate ideas and decide what the appropriate students are as a sort of big group, rather than sort of an authoritarian style of governance. So yeah, it's a very troubling thing. And to sort of restate my answer to your question about like the insight, sort of the insider perspective that doesn't further discussion like a lot of people who worry about us.
Yeah, I did that on one of it. So it's kind of like when, so all works at multiple meetings. And we talk about connotative and denotative meaning. So a denotative meaning, the way to read this is the dictionary definition of denotative something like literally the word awake or woke means to have woken somebody else. So that's the denotative meaning of the word woke. Whereas the connotative meaning can have a lot different. And a dog whistle is often a connotative meaning of a word. Signal something to an audience, like in a way of right? It's usually used in a way to highlight certain audiences. So you'll hear about racist audio where you'll have certain words that will be like, oh, that's code, or this group or that. I'm trying to think of some right now, but
I can't think of a specific example, but I will say that this was before COVID and after parties, so whatever time, whatever years those were. The history department, I did not use it because I was using other books, but the history department used a book called Dog Whistle Politics for all of its adjunct professors. And I took over a class that was supposed to be taught an adjunct, and I would have taken it over. So we switched books. And the first day I walked in, and the student said, "I'm so glad you're not using that book, it's so biased." And I went, all books are biased. We had that whole conversation, but it was, for when I hear dog whistle, what I hear is, a dog whistle is something that in an actual definition, right, is a whistle that only dogs can hear, right? So if you're using that, whatever the whistle is, then there are only certain people who are going to react. And so it's very similar to what we said. It's very similar to hearing if you know. There's nothing that cliche drives me crazy, because if you don't know, then you're on the outs. And it's a very divisive thing. And so to me, dog whistle politics I'm trying to say something that's not working very well. Anyway, the point is, when we use that book, that was before woke had been kind of taken over, right? And so it was a very clear book aimed at being aware that people who are upset by looking at race and class and gender and all these other kind of categories, that they are not aware or they are not woke yet, right? And so it's amazing how in like just these few years that has been flipped, like I don't think we could use that dog as politics with now and get away with it. I think there would be a significant backlash, but 5 years ago, there was none. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it made sense in my.
Just the way that I'm thinking of it is, there's an intention behind, taking over a particular term or appropriating that term, especially when it's being used by political elites. So kind of what you guys are saying is like that dog whistle is intended to signal to their audience something. And we've identified through a lot of this conversation that using the term woke is intended to signify something negative. Snowflake, liberal, leftist, sleep, stupid, like those types of terms. So I guess what I was hoping we could think about or talk about is, then what? Once they signal to their audience, they're signaling this dog whistle of it, like Bud Light or the Little Mermaid woke. Okay, so now I know as a listener, I'm supposed to think negatively about that. Now, like, what is the power of political elites weaponizing those dog whistles?
Well, I think it does the thing that goes to the question you asked earlier, which was, it takes away our ability to organize and use our own terms to like use our own words to describe ourselves. Because if every word we come up with, any group comes up with to describe themselves, and then taken and co-opted by the opposing side as a negative, and all of a sudden, you know, what you have no, you can't describe yourself, you can't have words, and I don't want to cliche, but on some level, having these unifying terms is really helpful. But if they become pejorative, then you have no way to describe yourself, and it's hard to work with. And it's interesting because I'm trying to think of analogs on the conservative side where, you know, where this has been done by the left. The left has demonized things on the right. Maybe some things around Trump, you know, Trump supporters, things like that. I mean, even just having a clip show of, let's be honest, some really ignorant people. And that does not represent the majority of people who vote for Trump. It really, and let's not make a politics to say, the majority of people who vote for Trump are not that stupid. And they find the most stupid ones to put on TV because people like me like to laugh at stupid people, right? But that's actually what divides us even more. And I feel like we gotta recognize that, like, so many people voted for Trump and they don't all think that, they don't all look like that, they don't talk like that. That is the slim minority. Just like the slim minority of progressives think that Israel is evil. Like that's not the majority of progressives either, but we hear like these little slivers, and this really bothers. I'm getting a little excited. I'm sorry, but that's my point. We lose our ability to have those conversations and to try to relate together. So I say, went away on progress.
So from talking to colleagues and friends in my own circle, I view woke as more of a, not really an awareness of social disparities, but acknowledging social disparities. So from the macro level, you know, systemic racism, but then on a micro level, knowing that you can't call a meeting a powwow because that offends people. So there's various levels of where it lies to me, and that's acknowledging that those things exist. And personally, I am very frustrated because as the co-chair for the formerly diversity committee here on campus, we are now called the Cultural Appreciation and Engagement Committee because we're not allowed to use the words diversity, equity, or inclusion. Try coming up with a name that means diversity, equity, inclusion without using those words. It's extremely difficult. But my question for you is that it seems like because of things like social media, and I'll say, I think because of social media, you need a hashtag to make something viral or something sick. So when you can't go out there and say hashtag social disparities do exist, but please stop, you know, whatever. People need a shorter version. They go, oh, hashtag dog whistle, hashtag whatever. Do you think we're at a point now where we do need to acknowledge the effect of social media, as silly as it sounds, on our new history, or moving forward our history.
Yeah, there's, so I spent some time looking at, I kept Googling history of, historians of wokeness. And there's a big argument within the historical community about, what role historians play on social media. So in particular, historians tend to write long things. We don't like to write short things. And so 160 characters on whatever Twitter's called now, is hard. It's hard to do. And so there's an argument within the historical community about how involved historians should be in current events. And there are some people who argue we should stay out of it, and there are some people who say, but we have this knowledge and people want the answers, and we have the ability to talk about it, so why shouldn't we? And so I do think that there is a very real movement within the historical community. Heather Cox Richardson is the one that I paid the most attention to. But she just wrote a book that I just really called Democracy Awakening. It's like, oh, look at that. And she has kind of made a name for herself other than being a scholar at Yale or Harvard, wherever she gets somewhere. I can't remember off the top of my head. She posts every day on the blog, which then also posts to her Facebook, which also then posts to Twitter or whatever. And it's kind of a rundown. This is what happened today. And so she gives kind of a link to it on social media, and then she links in her blog, here are all the sources that I use. And so that's a really good example of a historian using social media in a way that is not reductionist and also is not, it's not too long, like you could read it in maybe 5 minutes. So that, and her book, Democracy Awakening, is actually a collection of those articles that she's made. So there is a real kind of fight within the community, and I think, to be fair, those who are using social media are winning that fight in history. Because historians are, for the most part, they have to get jobs. And the way you do that is you publish. And so if you can use social media to get your information out there, then you're going to use it. So I think within the net, to be real fair, I think there's a dissertation on that in about 20 years. Like what role does social media have in the kind of writing industry of the United States? I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, and it's easy to dominionize the word woke. Because obviously it's been around for a really long time. It's not new. But then it's really easy for people to make joke, hashtag woke, haha, everybody laughs. But it's that's not the book, is the hashtag.
So I think historians have trouble with that, not trouble with the book, but historians have trouble writing things shortly. So we kind of just go, okay, we're going to be woke by publishing these things. And we stop using that word, but we're doing that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's time for one more question.
I just want to be back on that. So we talked about the advertisements that are related to advertisements. They're just pictures of things, and specifically the Little Mermaid. I feel like the word woke would be weaponized for dog whistle. What people that are really creative of Black and marginalized groups to be at the forefront of not even be there, just country. We talked about rewriting history, and we see that with Disney when they're coming out with different movies and different scripts, like Lightyear, you see more gay characters, you see more Black characters, and all that celebrated in marginalized communities. The right side and the conservatives are using it as another thing, like the Little Mermaid. It's not political in any way. Disney just remade the Little Mermaid. They added one song that wasn't in the movie, and the mermaid happened to be Black, and there was an extreme outrage. So I feel like it's really important, not just as a brand, not just as political science. When we talk about the word woke and the culture that surrounds it, it's a dog whistle for people being afraid of Black culture being a forefront of America. When it's been there in Irish time, when it's in the spotlight, the conservatives are afraid. And my question to you guys is, how do you fight against that within your own students and your own class? Because if you have a student that is afraid of that, I mean, it's all over that, everyone has something racism in their brain. How would you try to be aware of that? Because most of you, or at least one of you, is in marginal. And you are someone that is a base for children in marginal.
Well, what I was gonna say is that I think what I would do is that I gotta emphasize that the people that would use woke and like especially the media properties that we were mentioning, they are purposely aiming at the wrong target. Because, you know, yes, it's a remake of The Little Mermaid, but you're talking about Disney, right? There are a million legitimate things you can criticize about Disney. Right? I mean, this is one of the biggest media corporations on the planet, right? We could talk about labor, we can talk about the way they treat their the cast members at Disney World, their writers, the actors. We could talk about so many different things, but we're talking about this. And so I think if we can, you know, the casting, we talk about the Little Mermaid being woke, Lightyear being woke, you're taking your eye out of the ball. You're focusing on something that really doesn't, that is not that important, and you're not really focusing on, say, the bigger picture. And that's kind of how, if I was teaching a class, that's how I try to reword that assumption. Because there's a million legitimate criticisms, and you know, you're upset that the Little Mermaid is African American, like that's not even something that should register. And so I think a lot of times people that use that phrase, they want to make it seem like they're up against, there are these crusaders against this huge corporation, when that's the last thing we're looking for. That is not what we're looking for. And so we should like reject that out of hand. That is not something that we should require.
I like the way you're approaching this from the sense of the way many people are using the term woke is in a sense sort of like a reactionary sort of I am scared of seeing sort of lesbian and gay couples. I'm scared of seeing the race of the cartoon character be different, a remake, or just acknowledging different sort of more progressive social activism that current and that is when it comes to dealing with that for my club, I'm trying to have a dialogue about political topics. It's difficult in the sense of the problem in that situation is not it's sort of breaking down what somebody needs today or needs to turn book, because obviously it seems to be very vacuous, doesn't seem to have a straightforward meaning to it. So when somebody says, well, we don't know for sure, maybe they're scared of seeing gay people or they're scared of sort of acknowledging racial issues. So getting down to that and then trying to understand the sort of the actual sort of like feeling that is coming from the individual that's espousing that sort of idea. Getting to that, because the United States is a democracy, there are all kinds of people in this country, and you can't just push them away from the conversation. In a sense, for them having sort of a homophobic versus behind some common engage with them and engage with those toxic ideas. And that's very difficult from the perspective of us who's trying to facilitate it all. Because that's in the sense that ignorance is very difficult to actually sort of empathize with if you're not a part of that sort of bubble. So that is sort of a major challenge that I've always sort of been worried about as a person, is especially in how various sort of the sort of hostility when it comes to say trans issues, as we saw as that in the presentation. That's very much like a very hostile environment which you try to discuss these topics. You have somebody who's going to use the term woke or sort of transphobic and homophobic. It's very, very difficult to have those conversations to try to emphasize with someone who's very different yourself. And hence I, as a president, want people to sort of try and empathize with that sort of extreme sort of piece of America's democracy that for the most part, that sort of ignorant sort of aspect that's always going to be there, that's always going to be in democracy. There, at least try to understand where is from that particular individual. But yeah, that's a very. Right, convenient when you're trying to facilitate documenting students.
I don't think any ethical teacher wants to quote unquote rewire students. I think most of us are hoping to say, like, this is a safe place to explore your ideas. And if you say that, let's look at this side, but let's also look at this side, and let's all discuss both fairly, but I don't think most of us are trying to rewire people, that's not really an agenda.
I mean, if we could rewire, we could rewire you to like, say the syllabus for your section. First, maybe we would do that.
Want to thank you all for stumbling through this conversation with us. It's been easy, but that's kind of the point of this forum, is to come together and stumble through some of the more difficult conversations that we're having here at events. I think my biggest takeaways today are, first, I mean, think about what is the goal of somebody using that? It's intended to incite emotion, right? It's if you're conservative and you hear something is woke, now you know what to do. Right? And if you're liberal and somebody told you woke, now you know that they hate you, right? So when you feel those emotions, kind of like our panelists said, don't react so immediately. As soon as you feel that emotion, ask questions. What exactly did you mean by using that term? What specifically are you talking about? Seeing what's the intention of somebody using that word, I think could help us facilitate a little bit more discourse. And as you guys all mentioned, these ideas of disagreement, some of us call it ignorant. There are probably people in the room that wouldn't consider ignorance just their belief, and we all have to coexist. So we all have to learn how to talk to one another, and that doesn't mean that we necessarily don't stand up for things that seem to be clearly wrong, but we still have to learn how to have this conversation. So again, wanted to thank you guys for coming. Dr. Green was supposed to be closing remarks, but she overdid herself as usual. Anyway, thank you guys so much. I'm gonna try and make sure